Hi, welcome to Psych 101 Introduction to Research. Today we're going to talk about different research methods. The way we perform the methods will be based on our design and would also be guided by our approach, in essence quantitative or qualitative, and also the paradigm that we prescribe to. So even though these can be general research methods, how they are implemented might vary depending on approach and paradigm. These are just some examples of the common collection tools that we use in psychology. First, we have observation. Now, observation is simply observing specimens in their natural habitat. This type of observation is called naturalistic. So, for example, I want to understand group learning dynamics, and as a researcher, I'm gonna go to the natural habitat of the student, which I assume is still the library. Now, I'm gonna observe from a distance students engaging in group learning sessions, and I'm gonna see how they converse, what motivates them to study, how they distribute work, etc. Now, it's not gonna come as a surprise if they also talk about other things. Sometimes they might talk about their love life, chismes, sometimes they might talk about games, etc. But in essence, what I'm doing is stalking. Now, the downside though is if they realize that I'm watching them, they might alter their interaction and responses. So their public behaviors might change and they might say, oh, I love this class, I love these readings, okay, let's study more. And it's not gonna be natural anymore. That is called the observer effect. It can be remedied though with established rapport, prolonged interaction, just so they won't have the feeling they need to hide things from you. Another type of observation is participant observation, wherein you are actually telling your participants that you're going to be joining them. Another one is the laboratory setup, wherein you are in a controlled setup and you're going to observe interactions or behaviors through double-sided glass, etc. The upside with laboratory setups is you can have equipment, sophisticated equipment that can allow you to gather more sensitive data. For example, biofeedback, in case you have biofeedback machinery. So from a distance, the researcher would just be taking observations, looking at the data behind the glass. But again, these have biases, such as confirmation bias, wherein we see what we want to see and disregard things that doesn't confirm our hypothesis. Another downside to observation is the fact that it can really only deal with public behaviors. Private behaviors are going to be harder to observe. For example, if I'm interested in casual sex, mating behaviors, I'm not gonna go ask people around, hey, can I observe you having sex with your significant other? You are gonna get a very angry, shocked response and be considered unethical. So that's a no-no. What we can do to observe private behaviors are, well, not really observe but study private behaviors are to survey. Just like what Sir Don Gaba did when he studied casual sex. And like in his method, comfort is key to honesty, so we can structure our surveys that way. Mind you, surveys can be simultaneously qualitative or quantitative in approach. So it's good for lots of people, but you can't get clarifications about their answers. Another method is the case study. So in the case study, we are just focusing on one specimen or one individual or one participant, just so we can gather as much in-depth data as we can. This is good for rare phenomena. A very notorious case study was Sybil, and indeed her phenomena was rare. She was one of the first documented extreme cases of dissociative identity disorder. So Sybil had a very abusive childhood. Her mother was allegedly a schizophrenic who would put an enema into her and she would kick her, not allowing her to pee despite having an enema while she played the piano. She would abuse her. She would tie her up from a pulley on their farm if she would color incorrectly. So To combat the abuse, she developed a lot of personalities which she would slip in and out of. Some were even kids, some were boys, some were full adults. And she had a total of 16 personalities inside her. But this was later reported to be contentious and debunked because she actually lived with her therapist and her state made her susceptible to suggestion, somewhat Freudian. So, another one is the correlation, and this was actually the trend during the empirical era, correlation and causality. So in correlation, we are observing the relationship of two variables. It can be directly proportional or inversely proportional. A fascinating correlation study is the correlation of exciting dates and the susceptibility to attraction. So the correlation of riding a roller coaster and getting a second date. Don't you just love how fantastic psychology can be? Who wakes up and just say, I think I'm going to study roller coasters today. But anyway, in this study, they found that people who went on more exciting dates, such as riding a roller coaster, actually had a higher chance of going to a second date because the arousal from the exciting ride translated into attraction. Arousal is neutral and context gives us interpretation. Just to note, correlation is not equal to causality. It's just a measurement of covariation of variables. So if you suddenly take out of your crush, take her to Enchanted Kingdom, push her on the street, make her adrenaline rise, that is not going to be tantamount to love. Let's just clarify that right now. And lastly, the highest order of the methods is the experiment, and it is the highest because of its capacity to sort of infer causality. Here we have independent variables that are manipulated to see its effect on a dependent variable, while confounders or nuances are controlled. In order to see this, random assignment of participants to either a control group or an experimental group is done. The experimental group has exposure to the independent variable and the control group does not. And the observer or the researcher observes all the encounters, all the possible outcomes that can happen because of the exposure. But note that this can be prone to bias, like any method. We can have confirmation bias, wherein we see what we want to see and again disregard anything that does not comply with our hypotheses. We can also have the placebo effect, wherein a participant also has certain hypotheses about a study and they would perform that hypothesis, or that would influence how they react to the study. For example, you put spinach supplements and that would increase their stamina. It can be very intuitive, and the person in a control group knowing this might actually perform having enhanced stamina. Again, that is the placebo effect. Another threat to experimentation is that the experimenter can actually influence the participants subtly, wittingly or unwittingly. So they might actually give hints, whether they know it or not, about the hypothesis that they would like to confirm, and the participant would act accordingly. It's kind of like inception, a seed has been planted and once it's there, it's just gonna manifest. That one we call the experimenter bias. Luckily, we have controls. Good experiments is all about good control and reduction of bias, reduction of confounders. Okay? And like any psychological research, you need to have that creativity and that resourcefulness to have successful data collection. Now, to combat the aforementioned effects, you can do the single blind study wherein the participant doesn't actually know which group they are in. So this can combat placebo effect. Doesn't matter what hypothesis they have. They don't know what they are given, so they don't really have any inferences as to how to act based on what they were given. Another strategy would be to do a double-blind study wherein both the participant and the experimenter are unaware of how groups were randomly assigned. So the experimenter won't also have confirmation bias or experimenter effect because they don't know how to hint to participants on how they would act. Now, because we are dealing with life and living participants, of course we need to have certain standards to how we conduct our research, both ethically, validly, and reliably. These would be our guide in order to achieve the three. So I'm just going to simplify this into two. We need to have a balance of critical mindedness and open mindedness. That is the first. It doesn't matter if an authority says something. It doesn't matter if you have a hypothesis. You need to be critical about whatever information you have. And you also need to be open about the information that you can observe, so as to combat bias. And lastly, we have to take care of our participants. It has to be ensured that no harm will come to them. They need to know what they're getting into, so there has to be informed consent. You can use deception, arguably, in psychological researches, so long as there's debriefing after and deception is argued for accordingly in the research design. But you need to be wary of unintended outcomes, harms, and risks that can go to your participant, and you need to debrief them to tend to that. Because at the end of the day, it's not just about the data and the science that we sort of progress or improve. Psychological research is about ethical objectivity, matataong pagsusuri. Kasi tao ang inaaral natin at dapat ang inaaral natin babalik din sa tao. So that's Intro to Psych Research Methods. I'll see you next time.